and I'll also be referring back to it a bunch as we go along. So I'm going to start John 11, chapter 1, and read all the way through to verse 44. You can read along with me there. John writes this: "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And after this, he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going to go there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him.' After saying these things, Jesus said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I will go to awaken him.' The disciples said to him, 'Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover.' Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. So Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.' Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you.' Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' But Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?' She said to him, 'Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.' When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, 'The teacher is here, and he's calling for you.' And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' They said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.' But some of them also said, 'Couldn't he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?' Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days.' Jesus said to her, 'Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?' So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me.' When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, 'Unbind him and let him go.'" I want to start by saying thank you to you all for your hospitality to Ruth Ann and I in these last couple months. Ruth Ann and I have talked often and reflected often of just how vital to our spiritual health and well-being, endurance in the midst of the last couple months these gatherings have been, to just be able to in real time gather together and talk with and hear updates from fellow believers and fellow followers of Jesus, especially given that we have been unable to meet with the church families that we were both a part of before we got married. We're just really thankful that you all have made space for us in these last months, in the summer leading up to our wedding, and then still now since we've been married. We've been we after getting married moved into a neighborhood in Hamilton that's an identified move-in patch, but there's no particular move-in team here, and so we've over the last months just been spending a lot of time praying for this neighborhood, and slowly have been meeting other believers and meeting and getting to know our neighbors, which has been a lot of fun. And so would really ask for your prayer as we continue to do that, in seeking to meet our neighbors, and then also get to know and find other believers to gather with and be on mission to this neighborhood with. A really special part of marriage, one of the special parts of marriage in the last couple of months, has been living alongside Ruth Ann as she has started her school year, and in the end of summer, and then in the first couple months, just getting to watch all the work and planning and thought and prayer that goes into the beginning of the school year for a teacher. And that's been special for me in particular because both of my parents are teachers, and so in seeing and watching Ruth Ann do all this work, I feel like I've kind of grown in an appreciation for all the work that my parents did as teachers, kind of appreciating who they were as teachers, and kind of realizing the fact that when you're a student, you just have no idea how much your teacher's doing sort of behind the scenes, that you just happily get on the bus and go home, and then they spend the night marking all the assignments that you've done throughout the day and planning, decorating the classroom. So just growing an appreciation for my parents, for my teachers, and I think share that in part as a life update, share it in part as a plug for you all to show appreciation to the teachers in your life, but also share it as a point of introduction to John 11 this morning, because I think in light of all that is going on in the world. All that's going on in the lives of people that I know and love, knowing some of the things going on in the lives of people gathered here together today. I think, increasingly realizing that in my relationship with Jesus, I feel a lot like, a student who does not have the capacity to fully appreciate all that Jesus as my teacher and my savior is doing. I don't fully know, I can't fully see all that Jesus is doing. I think I'm excited in that as we continue on in this series about encounters with Jesus in the Gospel of John, this morning we get to look at John 11 together, because it's a very real story of where Jesus is and what Jesus is doing and how Jesus relates to people when things are going really wrong. It's a story of Jesus going to a funeral of his close friends, and we get to watch and observe the kinds of things Jesus does and says in the midst of crisis and tragedy, when things are going really wrong. To that end, I just want to share three observations of where Jesus is when things are going wrong. I have you in mind. I've had you in mind as I've prepared. If you're somebody who is just in the thick of it right now, is in the midst of things going very wrong, of real difficulty and tragedy just kind of being your day-to-day reality, this would be of help to you in pointing Jesus out to you and helping you see how close Jesus is to you and where Jesus is in the midst of your life right now. And also, I've had the rest of you in mind too, because we're all called to be a community of people that bears each other's burdens and supports and is of help to each other. And so in pointing out where Jesus is in the midst of things going wrong. I hope to help and equip you as you support and care for others, but also help you as you seek to imitate Jesus as you help and look after other people. Three observations from John 11 about where Jesus is in the midst of things going wrong. The first one is this, that Jesus welcomes our questions and our confusion. Jesus welcomes our questions and our confusion. There's three times, once in verse 21, once in verse 32, and then in verse 34, where first Martha and then Mary and then crowds of people all come to Jesus and ask him some version of the question, where were you? Why were you not here a week ago when Lazarus was sick and about to die? If you were here, if you had shown up sooner, Lazarus would not be dead right now. And I think to kind of feel the emotional weight of this question, we've got to imagine what this must have been like for Martha and Mary. Think about, their last months and years to date would have been spent watching Jesus carry out all of these miracles and listening to his teaching, seeing the way that he had the capacity to heal the sick, give sight to the blind. He's given life to people who are broken and without hope. And in a lot of his teaching, we read a couple weeks ago, he promises to be a shepherd who protects his sheep, who doesn't let things happen to his sheep, who doesn't let any of his sheep be snatched out of his hand. And so Martha and Mary would have heard Jesus teaching the crowds these things. They would have seen Jesus in the lives of seemingly strangers doing all of these incredible things. But now when it's somebody who's close, when it's somebody that Jesus apparently loves, he's nowhere to be found. He's not close by. And so you can hear the question in Martha and Mary's voice, like, why have you done all these things for all these other people? And yet when it's somebody that you love, when it's somebody that we love, you kind of let them die. Like, why is that? It doesn't make sense to us. And I think that question, as I reflect on my relationship with Jesus, as I think about the situations that people I know and love are in, that question has come up in my heart as well. If it's true, if all these stories we read in the Bible are true about the things that God is capable of doing, the things that Jesus is capable of doing, why don't we see those kinds of miracles in our day? Why don't we see Jesus, the people that we love who have passed away, see him raising them from the dead, or the people who we love who are ill and close to the point of death? Why doesn't Jesus show up and make them well? And similarly, maybe we do hear today of Jesus doing amazing things of healing or saving people or miraculously changing people's hearts. There's a question of, there's people that I love and care about that I don't see Jesus working in their lives. I see them kind of stuck in addiction. I don't see them finding the freedom and things that Jesus offers and gives. And I think often when we have those questions, and maybe many of you can think of similar doubts and questions or situations where you're feeling similar questions and doubts, when we feel those questions rising up in us, we kind of immediately put ourselves in the camp of an unbeliever, somebody who probably doesn't believe in Jesus very well, or a skeptic, or somebody who is not a very good Christian. But what I think John 11 shows us is that Martha and Mary are both people who love Jesus and are loved by Jesus, and they know that Jesus is a safe place to bring those questions and those doubts and confusions, that he welcomes, that he wants to be with us in our questions and confusion, that when we feel those doubts and that confusion, that disorientation kind of capturing us, or that we're stuck in that, Jesus wants us to bring all of ourselves to him and not hold back our doubts, but that he's a safe place to bring our questions and our confusion. So that's the first observation. And the second one is this, that Jesus shows us his love in delay. He shows us his love in delay. Look with me at verse 5 and 6 of John chapter 11. This is a couple of the most, I think, surprising verses in John's gospel so far. He says this: Jesus loved Martha, Jesus loved her sister, and he loved Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now that's very surprising and backwards to me, because if I were writing this account, what should those verses say? It should say Jesus loved Martha, Jesus loved Mary, Jesus loved Lazarus. And so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he dropped everything and went right away to help. You know, how many of us, if somebody that we loved was sick, especially if we're not in the midst of a pandemic, if we heard that somebody we loved was sick and close to death, would not drop everything and go. And so these verses to me are surprising and confusing, but I think extremely helpful, because they show us that when we feel like Jesus is late, when we feel like his help, when we feel like his direction, when we feel like our feeling of his presence is overdue, that we've waited too long, our instinct is to think it's an expression of his lack of love for us, that he's somehow overlooking us, or he isn't caring for us, or that maybe we've done something wrong that is causing him to withhold his love for us. But what these two verses in John 11 show us is that actually when we have that feeling, when Jesus is seemingly delayed, it's actually an expression of his love for us. That feeling of that tension of waiting on God is actually an expression of it's because of Jesus' love for us. And this is true if you look at these verses, that Jesus' delay, his delay in those 2 days is because of his love for Martha and Mary. It's not contrary to his love. And the same in our lives, that when we feel that waiting, it's actually an outworking of an expression of Jesus' love and patience and kindness. And this is true in a couple of ways. In John 11, Jesus' love means that he wants us to see and know his glory fully. He wants us to fully know his power and what he's capable of. And in John 11, his delay means that Lazarus is beyond dead by the time he gets there. He very oddly says to his disciples, for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you might believe. And so his delay works out in him receiving glory, because by the time he's there, only Jesus has the power to actually heal and raise Lazarus from the dead. And so when he calls Lazarus out from the dead, people have no choice but to believe, to acknowledge, and to glorify Jesus, to worship Jesus, and to fall at his feet. But I think also personally, I've seen this delay as an expression of Jesus' love, by the way that in those seasons of waiting, in those seasons of feeling like Jesus is delayed, very often those are the times where I'm brought to see how futile and how insufficient all the other things that I trust in and look to, that I worship, are in comparison to Jesus. That it's in the waiting, in the times of waiting, that those things are stripped away and taken away, and that I'm led to repentance, to giving up other idols, and to trusting fully in Jesus. And this is true in our individual lives, and this dynamic of God showing his love is true in his relationship to humanity and to all of creation. I've been thinking a lot about this verse in 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter writes, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you. He doesn't want anyone to perish, but he wants everyone to come to repentance." I think Peter is saying a similar thing, that God's delay in fulfilling the promise that he makes to return, to make all things new, to restore and bring about the renewal of all things, to not just with Lazarus, but with everybody who's ever died, to raise them back to life. That promise that he makes, God is not slow or unfaithful in keeping his promise, but The delay that we're experiencing now of that in a broken world and in a world marked by sin and sickness and death is actually an expression of God's faithfulness, of God's kindness, and his desire for people to turn from their sin and to fully trust in him. So those are the two things so far. That first, Jesus welcomes our questions and our confusion. That Jesus shows his love in delay. And lastly, if we're looking for Jesus in tragedy, if we're looking for Jesus when things are going wrong, we will find that Jesus is suffering with us, that Jesus grieves and suffers with us. The scene that John paints in John 11, especially from verse 28 onwards, is a picture of a huge group of people all weeping and grieving. There's Martha and Mary who both come to Jesus and are weeping, are crying. And there's this whole group of Jews, of friends of Lazarus, people from the city who have all come and are all together weeping and crying. And Jesus, John points out Jesus in the midst of that group of people and points out that Jesus is with them grieving, but that his grief is actually also is deeper. It runs a lot further down than anyone in the crowds. John writes that he's deeply anguished in his spirit, that he's greatly moved and greatly troubled. And there's this reality that John is pointing out to us, that Jesus is not only with us in our suffering. He's not only with Lazarus and his family in grieving death, but that his grief and his sorrow is actually much deeper than anything that we experience. Because at the tomb of Lazarus, he's not only grieving the death of his friend, but he's also grieving the cosmic reality of death and grieving the loss of everyone who's ever lost a friend to sickness. He knows because of his identity as the Son of God, he's come from the right hand of the Father and was with God the Father in creation, and so knows God's intent for life and the goodness of creation, and so knows how far humanity has fallen, knows how drastic the effects of sin and death are on humanity, and so is not just grieving the loss of Lazarus in that moment, but is grieving fully the reality of death across the scope of history. And that's true in each of our situations as well, that Jesus is not only with us, grieving with us in our sorrow, but he is, in a much bigger way, has experienced everything that we are grieving, anything that we're sad about. He has experienced it and is grieving it to a much deeper degree. And that's true with Jesus beside Lazarus in the tomb. And you might say, well, how do we know that that's still true today? Now that Jesus is resurrected and back in heaven, how do we know that he's still grieving and suffering with us? And was reading Acts 9 the other day, which I think is a great passage, which teaches us about that when Paul is persecuting the church, is pursuing and hunting down Christians, Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears to him and says, not, Paul, why are you persecuting the church? Why are you persecuting my people? But he asks, why are you persecuting me? Jesus is so bound up with his church, so bound up with his people that when they experience suffering, when they experience persecution, he himself is experiencing that same suffering and persecution and grief with us. And so there's this degree to which there's a reality in which Jesus' grief is with us. It's this incredible empathy that he has with us. But there's also, as we zoom out a little bit and look at the context of John 11 and the ending of John 11, that we see that Jesus' grief and suffering is also a substitution. He's also suffering in our place. If you remember the passage that we read last week, you'll remember that Jesus has just had to flee from Jerusalem because of the people that were trying to take his life, because of the claims that he was making. He has just had to flee out of Jerusalem because people were trying to stone him and to arrest him. And now, in order to go back to where Lazarus has died, the reality is that he has to go back to within arm's reach of the people who are just trying to kill him. There's, the disciples, as they're deciding to go back, the disciples ask Jesus in John 11, verse 8, why would you want to go back to Jerusalem? The Jews were just trying to stone you there. They were just trying to kill you. And then in verse 18, John writes that Bethany was only about 2 miles away from Jerusalem. So there's, in order to go back to Jerusalem and to be close to Lazarus, Jesus has to put himself in danger. He has to go back towards the people who are trying to kill him and to harm him. And then after Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, there's this council of Pharisees that get together and say, because of what Jesus has just done, there's too many people believing in him. And so it's Jesus giving life to Lazarus in verse 53 of John chapter 11 that we read. It's from that day on. It's from the day that Jesus resurrected Lazarus onwards that is actually the final nail in the coffin of the Pharisees putting Jesus to death and planning to put him to death. And so in order to give Lazarus life, in order to be within arm's reach of Lazarus and his family, to suffer and grieve with Lazarus, Jesus is giving up his own life. In order to call Lazarus out of the tomb, Jesus actually has to go into the tomb. And so his grief in another way is also his anticipation of his own death, his awareness of the cost of him being with Mary and Martha and the cost of giving Lazarus life. That is true of each of our stories as Christians, that our life with Christ, any spiritual life that we have, that we were dead, we were all, because of the effects of sin, because of our love for sin, we were dead, and any spiritual life that we have is because Jesus gave up his life for us, because he took our place in the tomb to give us life. And so when Jesus asks us to trust him when things are difficult, when he asked him to trust him in the midst of suffering, in the midst of things going wrong, he's inviting us as one who has entered into our suffering, who knows and has experienced our suffering and our grief, and has given up his life to give us life, and to give us hope. And that when we're trusting him, we're trusting someone who has power and authority over sin and death, and has given up his life to begin and work out the reversal of the effects of sin and death. So we're going to transition now into a time of communion, of taking communion together. And so I'll invite you to grab your bread and wine as we prepare to do that. As we do, we'll be listening to a song as we take that. And I want to leave you with, I think, the encounter with Jesus that Martha has, that's at the heart of John chapter 11. There, Jesus has this conversation with her, starting in verse 23, where he approaches Martha and says, What do you believe about your brother? What do you think is going to happen to him? Do you believe that he's going to rise again? And there Martha says, well, yeah, I have this hope that there is a resurrection and a life. There is a future hope. But Jesus presses past that and says, Martha, the hope that you have is not just a vague kind of future hope of resurrection and new life in the future, but the hope that you have is in me. It's right now. It's standing right in front of you in who I am, and in the closeness that I am to you, and the power that I have over death. And in communion, I think we get to experience the same thing, that we proclaim that Jesus is the resurrection of the life and the life, that he has power over sin and death. But by God's grace, it's not just a vague future hope, but when we take communion together, we have a hope that we can hold in our hands. that's present, that's living, that's active, and it has substance. Just as Jesus appeared to Martha personally, he gives us a hope that we can hold on to with our hands. It's tangible and touchable. It's something that can be tasted and seen. And so when we take communion, we're remembering that it's Jesus' death, it's Jesus' resurrection that gives us a holdable hope, a very real and tangible hope. I invite you to take that now, to reflect on that now as we listen to this next song.